right, I'm going to ask you to turn right to Hebrews chapter 11, and we're going to jump right in as we pick up on the life of Abraham. And this particular story is, I think, by far, arguably the most difficult command given by God to someone to obey. Now remember, Abraham is one who is known for his faith. He has trusted in God. He has followed God when God told him to leave his home, to leave his people, to leave his family, and go to a land that he didn't know of. Abraham also believed when God made a covenant with him, a unilateral covenant, that he would make him into a great people. He would grant him descendants as numerable as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashores. God said that he would raise up a son. He would grant him a son. And so when we reach this passage where God asks Abraham to offer up the life of his son, Isaac, the son whom he loved, the son of the covenant. This is really something that maybe we might have heard the story, but do you consider the ramifications of what it means to live a life by faith? You see, one of the things that really caused me to ponder the gravity of this is, what if God asked you to do something that you just could not understand or fathom? And I think for parents, for those of us who are parents, by far I think this would be just mind-boggling. Why would God ask you to offer up your child as a burnt offering? And I thought about this all week. God tests us to see if we trust him. Now you might think, is that fair? Well, it's not an issue of fairness. The issue is, if you say you have faith in God, that you trust Christ to be your Savior and Lord, do you actually trust him? Do you walk in such a way that shows that you believe in who he is? Faith is the assurance of things hoped for and the conviction of things not seen. There are so many things that we might not grasp, but do you still trust? Will you still trust and obey? So looking at Hebrews 11, let's start at verse 17. And it says, by faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promises was offering up his only son, to whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called. Now, as I mentioned, it's enough that God has already asked Abraham to do so much. Leave your land, leave the Ur of the Chaldees, leave your people, leave your family, go to this land, and I'm going to give this land as an inheritance, but the thing is, you'll never actually get to enjoy that inheritance. In fact, you're going to be a sojourner. You're going to live in tents in a foreign land for the rest of your life. And Abraham trusted God, and he went. He was told that he would have many descendants, but he didn't even have one child of his own. So he and Sarah decided to take things in their own hands. They had a child by Hagar, brought Ishmael into the scene, and by their human wisdom introduced the whole Middle Eastern conflict. Your choices have consequences. But then God tells Abraham, Sarah is going to have a son. Now, mind you, he had to wait until he was almost 100 years old. Now, I'm 57. And if God came to me and said, hey, John, Angela's going to have a son. We only have daughters, so I'm going to give you a son. And I don't know, I'd be thinking like, I'm a little old for this. I mean, I'm a grandfather already. Okay, I hang out with Benny for an hour and a half, and it wipes me out. I'm so tired. I love it, but when he says bye-bye, I'm like, bye-bye, because I got to go take a nap. You feel for the parents because they got to deal with this all day. So I'm thinking, Abraham, they lived longer then, but he's still almost 100. Just think of that. And Sarah is 90. No wonder when she hears God say, Sarah's going to have a baby, she's laughing. She's like, are you kidding me? I am withered up. I am not in a position to have a baby here. I'm old. But against all odds, they have a baby. They have the Son of the Covenant. They have laughter. When he was born, Sarah says, laugh with us, enjoy. Who would have thought that I would have given birth to a baby in my old age and given Abraham an heir, the Son of the Covenant? God's promises are being kept. So, in Genesis 21, there's a few events that lead up to this highlight point. After Sarah has given birth to Isaac, there comes a time where Ishmael is kind of messing around. He's kind of mocking Isaac, making fun of him. So Sarah says to Abraham, you need to get rid of Hagar and Ishmael. They have no place here. Now imagine for Abraham, this is still his son. No matter the circumstances, this is still part of his family. But Ishmael is not the son of the covenant. He is the son of their human efforts trying to make something happen. So Abraham dismisses Hagar and Ishmael. And there's an account where he has a dispute with Abimelech and Phicol over wells that Abraham had dug in their area. So they finally came to agreement where it says they cut a covenant to make peace over that. And then Abraham ends up at Beersheba where he plants a tamarisk tree. And it says there, he called upon the name of Yahweh, the everlasting God. Now when you read that account, you might just kind of breeze through it and go, okay, that's great, nice. But you got to understand now, at this point, things are good. He is settling at Beersheba. He's planted a tree. They now have wells of water. Things are good. Isaac is here. He's the son of the covenant. It couldn't be any better. Now turn to Genesis chapter 22. And this is the account of what Hebrews 11 describes. Turn to Genesis 22, starting at verse 1. And it says, now it happened after these things that God tested Abraham. Okay, so Hebrews 11, Abraham was tested. It's just straightforward. It's explicit. God tested Abraham. This was deliberate. And God said to him, Abraham. I remember just reading that and thinking, what would you do if God calls you? Just calls your name. If I heard God call and say, John, and I think, well, a lot of Johns. Could be some other John. John Kim. Many other John Kims. Okay. John Moonhang Kim. Okay, that's me. I don't know anyone else by that name. When I say my Korean name, people laugh. They're like, what kind of name is that? They don't even know. Okay, that's me. Abraham says, here I am. There's so much more involved here than you might think. God is talking to you. I mean, if God came to you and called your name, would you be like hey, what up, God? How's things going? You created any new galaxies lately? I mean, would you just kind of be casual about it? Or would you understand when God speaks, are you presenting yourself before him? Abraham says, here I am. And you got to wonder, he might be thinking, what is God going to ask me to do now? He's asked me to do so much. He's already asked me to leave my country, my people, my family. He's called me to live in tents the rest of my life. This is not an easy path. I'm just thinking, Abraham's got to wonder, what next? I often think of that too. God, what next? What will each year bring? Verse 2, then God said, take now your son, your only son whom you love, and go forth to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. That's all it says. Now again, think of just what this means. God is very clear to Abraham. He says, take your son. You only got one son. Okay, you dismissed Ishmael. This is your son, your only one, and this is the son whom you love. And then he names him Isaac. Take Isaac, your son, your only son, the son that you love. Go to the land of Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering. Now, if you have any sense of who God is, your first thought might be, God, I don't understand. This is not something that seems matching with who you are. This is not the kind of God that you are. The pagan gods do stuff like this. Okay? The pagan people offer up their children as burnt offerings. But God, why? Well, God was testing him. God wanted to test Abraham in a way that must have been so difficult for Abraham to understand. Again, it says there in Genesis 22, when God tested Abraham. God tested Abraham. Now, what do you think was going on in Abraham's heart and mind? I mean, this is so straightforward. It's not ambiguous. It's not unclear. It says, take Isaac. He names Isaac. Take Isaac, the son, your only son, the son that you love. Offer him as a burnt offering. Now, in Leviticus chapter 20, verses 1 through 5, there's a very strong admonition to the Israelites where they say, do not give your seed to Molech. Okay? In other words, don't offer up your children in fire like the Ammonites do, because they would take their babies and offer them up as burnt offerings in the valley of Hinnom. In Jeremiah 32:35, Jeremiah refers back to this, and he says, and they built the high places of Baal that are in the valley of Ben Hinnom to cause their sons and their daughters to pass through the fire to Molech, which I had not commanded them, nor had it come upon my heart that they should do this abomination to cause Judah to sin. When you see that word abomination, and you see different places in Scripture where God says, this is an abomination to me. I mean, this isn't just, that's kind of bad. This is horrendous. This is horrible. This is terrible. This is something that is absolutely wicked and evil. So why would God ask Abraham then to do something that just does not match with who God is and what he's about, at least as much as Abraham can understand? Now, we don't see any response. There's no response in the text from Abraham. All we see is in Genesis 22:3, it says this: So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took 2 of his young men and Isaac his son. He split wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Now, ask yourself, if Abraham were to respond to God, what would he say? What do you say to God? Would he try to negotiate? Would he question God? Did he even ask God why? We don't know. It doesn't say. All it says is that he got up early in the morning and he prepared for what was going to be a 3-day journey to Moriah. Now, one thought I had in my head was this: did Abraham tell Sarah? I mean, if you were Abraham, would you tell Sarah? And how do you think Sarah would respond? I mean, mother's here. What if your husband came up and he said, hey, honey, God told me to offer up the child as a burnt offering? What would you think? You might slap him, say like, you must have had too much pizza yesterday or something. That's not God. I mean, what's going on here? It doesn't say. And then for 3 days, Abraham travels with Isaac and 2 young men. There's no detail. It doesn't say if they talked about anything. It doesn't say they did anything. It's just 4 people: Abraham, Isaac, 2 young men. I don't even know the names of the 2 young men. Did they say anything? Well, we don't know until later when Isaac asks Abraham a question. But here's the main point here. Abraham is tested. How would you respond? For those of you who have children, do you love your children? Do you love your children so much that you would do anything for them? That you would even be willing to die for them? I would hope as parents there would be no hesitation on that. Of course. Of course I would die for my children. But if God were to ask me to kill them, I don't know how to reconcile that. I just don't. I mean, Abraham, you just have to wonder what was going on in his heart, in his head, as he is walking 3 days with his son to this place called Moriah. Here was the test. The test was this: did Abraham fear God? Did he trust him? Did he love God more than Isaac? Now, I think we have to be honest, parents. We might say we love God, but do you really? Do you really love God? Not only that, do you fear God? Do you fear him for who he is? Do you even know who he is? There's so many people who say they know God, and they come up with all these crazy depictions of who they think God is. There are plenty of people who go to church all their life. Do they really know God? They might say they do. But then if you're tested, you will be exposed as to what you really believe about God. Because what God expects is your obedience. He created you. He called you to a purpose. Do you trust that? Do you trust when God says, follow me, and I will tell you what is the right thing to do with your life in everything. I mean, Abraham must have been thinking, but Isaac, he's the child of the promise. God, how are you going to fulfill your plan if Isaac is dead? But then it says there, he offered up Isaac. He offered up Isaac. I mean, even in spite of what he understood. I mean, God made it very clear Isaac was going to be the vehicle through which his seed or his descendants would be named. Genesis 21:12. God said to Abraham, do not be distressed because of the boy or your maidservant. He's talking about Hagar and Ishmael. Whatever Sarah tells you, listen to her voice, for through Isaac your seed shall be named. You know, you have to understand back in those days, they didn't have books. They didn't have a lot of written things. They might have had scrolls, papyri, something, but they are very much an oral culture. So you listen carefully and you remember things. So when God tells Abraham, Isaac is through whom your seed will be named, you don't think Abraham's keeping this all in mind? He's like, okay, God, you said so, God. You made a covenant. You made a promise, so I trust you. So what does Abraham do? He just knows God made a covenant promise, and God does not break his promises. Do you believe that? Do you believe God doesn't break his promises? Do you believe who God is when he says, this is who he is? So Abraham simply obeyed. When it says he offered up Isaac, he was resolved. God, this is what you tell me to do. I will do it. No questions asked. There's no hesitation mentioned here. He got up the next morning. He saddled up the donkey. I mean, I'm thinking every second, every minute must have been excruciating. Because the end is going to be, my son is going to be put to death. And not just that, by my hand. Like, I don't get that. What father can even imagine killing your own child? It doesn't make sense. I mean, even after waiting 100 years to finally have Isaac be born, even after Sarah had to wait 90 years to finally bear a child. And we don't know how old Isaac was. It doesn't say. They speculate he must have been maybe anywhere from a young child to a young man. We know he could talk because we see words coming out. We know he's aware of things because he's asking, where's the sacrifice? So he's very much aware of what's going on. However many years they had together, you can only imagine Abraham and Sarah truly laughing because they were so happy to have this child. Yesterday I was hanging out with Vashik and Benny, and it was a long day. I was really tired. And Benny was just running around. He had a ball. He's just throwing it and chasing it. He's crawling to get it, and he's laughing, and he's just babbling. He's like, I just sat down on the floor because I'm so tired. But I'm just laughing. Because I'm just enjoying watching this. I'm not even doing anything. I'm just sitting there watching him. And it was like, he just kept going on. And I was like, how long can he do this? How long can he just throw a ball around and just laugh? He did for quite some time. I can't imagine in my old age receiving a command to do such a thing. But Abraham was completely submissive to the will of God. I mean, you want to talk about his faith? It wasn't because Abraham was such a great guy, right? We've talked about this. He messed up. He made Sarah lie twice. Say you're my sister. He took things into his own hands and had a son through Hagar because Sarah said to do so. Abraham was not a perfect man. He was not always so great in his faith. But how did he reconcile this? How did he deal with this? Well, go back to Hebrews 11, and it tells us how he was able to reconcile this. Okay, so go back to verse 17. By faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promise was offering up his only son, to whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called. That quote there is from Genesis 21, which I read earlier. Verse 19, here it is. He considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he also received him back. Abraham knew. How? I don't know. There were no records of someone being raised from the dead. I don't think he's heard of anyone being raised from the dead. But this is what he knew about God. God was able to raise the dead. He considered this. And that idea of considering is, it wasn't just some passing thought. He really thought through this. He contemplated this. Okay, if I know God for who he says he is, there's still a way. There's still a way. He is not going to break his promises. And the only way this can happen is if I have to kill Isaac, he's going to have to raise him from the dead. There's no other way. But God is able. Because I believe God is who he says he is. I mean, Isaac wasn't married yet. He had no children yet. There was no generation after Isaac. Isaac had to survive. Isaac had to be alive in order for him to then have children, for the generations to be grown. It's interesting. Abraham had 3 days to think about this. 3 days to consider. 3 days to ultimately conclude. God must raise him from the dead. Now again, there's no record of any conversation. We don't know what he was thinking. Go back to Genesis 22:4. It says, on the third day, okay, so it took 3 days, Abraham lifted up his eyes, saw the place from a distance where God told him to where to go. And Abraham said to the 2 young men, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there, and we will worship, and we will return to you. Okay, so think about it from the perspective of the 2 young men. Abraham has just told them, okay, hang out here with the donkey. We're going to go over there, and we're going to worship. We, Abraham and Isaac, we too are going to worship. And we too will return to you too, who are waiting with the donkey. Okay. I mean, there's a lot more here than you might think. Abraham is very deliberate about the words that he's using. You two wait here. Us two, we're going to go there. We're going to worship, and then us two are going to come back. These are words of faith. We will return to you. But before we return to you, we will worship. Not just Abraham, Isaac too. I mean, I can't imagine how gut-wrenching it must have been to say those words. You know, you ever have times where it's this idea of gut-wrenching, where you're just so tight, you're just so stressed, you're just so intense that you feel it here, you're just tight. Because you don't know what's going to happen. because you don't know how things will turn out. But you want to trust. You want to believe. Sometimes people might ask, hey, John, you must be a really strong Christian, right? I mean, you know all this Bible stuff, and you preach it, and you do all these things. I'm not always so strong. There are many times I'm weak. There have been times where it's gut-wrenching. There are things that happen that I just completely don't understand. But I do know this. I can trust God. I can trust in Yahweh. Trust in Yahweh with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge him. He will direct your paths. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Going back to Genesis 22. And this must have been where it was just the most, just emotionally just gripping time. I mean, if you could think of it as a movie scene, like this is where it's just there's this build-up where in verse 7, then Isaac spoke. So this is the first time we're hearing Isaac say something. Isaac spoke to Abraham, his father, and said, my father. Just that alone. Just that alone. Daddy. Daddy. What do you think Abraham's feeling when he hears that? Daddy. My father. The one who I trust. My father. And Abraham said, here I am, my son. And God called Abraham. He said, here I am. When Isaac says, my father, Abraham says, here I am, my son. And as he asks the question, you knew Abraham was just dreading this moment. Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, you just have to wonder, what was he thinking for 3 days? Well, we see God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the two of them walked on together. Then they came to the place of which God had told him, and Abraham built the altar there, and arranged the wood, and bound his son, Isaac, and put him on the altar on top of the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Just reading through this, it was so emotionally gut-wrenching. My father, just hearing that makes my heart hurt. Where's the lamb? Dad, we have the fire, we have the wood. Where's the offering? You said we're going to worship. We're going to offer up a burnt offering. God, where is it? Where is it? Abraham says God will provide. And it's interesting, he says this, God will provide for himself. God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering. I think sometimes we don't really orient how we think around God. We orient everything around me. Everything's about me. But he's had some time over the years to learn to trust God. So what he says is, God will provide for himself. God asked me to do this, he'll do it. He'll provide it. Abraham does not waver. Now, he builds the altar, he arranges the wood, and then it says he bound Isaac. And you got to ask, so what happened there? Did Isaac just go, I guess so, okay, I'll go on top, I guess I'll be the offering? I mean, we don't see any, there's no detail here again. Did Isaac struggle? When it finally dawned on him, did he question his father? We don't see anything other than he is laid on the fire, on the wood. I mean, Abraham is over 100 years old. Surely Isaac is at least physically able to run away. I don't know about you. I mean, any of you here, with your parents, and your dad's like, hey, can you just give me your hands? I'm going to bind them, and I'm going to put you on the wood so I can offer you up as a burnt offering to God. I don't know. If my dad told me that, I'd be like, no, thank you. I will go out for now. 3 days, it's a long trip. I mean, this is what we came for, Dad? I just wonder if Isaac, because again, it doesn't say here, does he just trust his father? And in so doing, does he trust God? I mean, this is not a small thing. His life, it's literally a life and death issue. Abraham does not disobey. He does not question God. He doesn't negotiate with God. He brought a knife. He got ready. And it says he held out his hand and he was about to slay his own son. I mean, it's very vivid there. He held out his hand with the knife and he raises it up and he's about to plunge it into his own son. Genesis 22:11, but the angel of Yahweh called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. I wonder why it said twice. Maybe just to make sure. Hey, Abraham, wait. And it's in the middle of the motion. His hand is raised. His knife is ready. And again, Abraham says, here I am. Every time he's called, he's like, here I am. God, here I am. God, Isaac, here I am, my son. Angel of Yahweh calls. Here I am. I'm right in the middle. What's going on? And he said, do not stretch out your hand against the boy and do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only one, from me. Abraham surely was tempted to treat Isaac as an idol, and it'd be totally understandable. The son of his old age, the son of the promise, son of the covenant. God wants to know, do you love me more than your own son? It just seems so unthinkable that God would test Abraham. What father would have his own son slain? There's actually someone, and that's God. You see, Abraham ultimately didn't have to offer up Isaac. He was willing to. He was in the very act, and God said, stop. I believe you fear me. You love me more. Don't hurt your son. Do nothing to him. And then it says, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, there was a ram after it had been caught in the thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. And Abraham called the name of that place, Yahweh will provide, as it is said this day, in the mount of Yahweh, it will be provided. Then the angel of Yahweh called Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn, declares Yahweh, because you have done this thing, you have not spared your son, your only son. Indeed, I will greatly bless you, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the stars of the heavens and as the sand which is on the seashore. And your seed shall possess the gate of his enemies. In your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because you have listened to my voice. And then it says in verse 19, again, you might miss this. So Abraham returned to his young men with Isaac. He said, we will go and worship, and we will return. And they returned. And they arose and walked together to Beersheba, and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Abraham was fully obedient, willing to do what God asked him to do, to offer up his only son. But God was equally committed to fulfilling his covenant promises. But God wanted to test Abraham to see if Abraham loved him more than Isaac. He wanted to see if he feared God and trusted God by not withholding his own son. And Abraham did. God provided a substitute. You know, one of the reasons why the Old Testament is so important to understand is that there are passages like this that are so rich in pointing to who? Christ, right? He is the substitute. He is the lamb. He is the one who will be offered up. You know, someone might think, how could God do such a thing? There's some liberal theologians that call it divine child abuse. That God sent his son to die on the cross. Now again, you know, we're not God. We don't understand the things of God that transcend our ability to understand. But what we do know is this: we are responsible for how we respond to God. You know, some people might ask something like this: what if Abraham didn't do this? What if Abraham refused? What if? Well, there's no what if. This is what Abraham did. He feared God. He trusted God. He obeyed God. Period. God did what he asked Abraham to do. He offered up his only son. And he didn't stop. You could put it this way: God is the one who put Christ to death. Yeah, the Romans were there. Yeah, the Jews did this. But what was really the greater plan? It was the deliberate offering of his own son as the substitute to save us from our sins. There's an Old Testament picture here that's pointing to Christ. God will provide the lamb. Now going back to Hebrews 11, and we're going to just kind of go through this part really quick. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau, and then by faith, Jacob blessed the sons of Joseph, and by faith, Joseph made mention of the sons of Israel. What's really interesting about that is when you think of the patriarchs, we usually see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those are the three. You call them the big three, right? Jacob has 12 sons, right? Now that's a mess, right? I don't know anyone who would want to be in Jacob's position, okay? He wants to marry Rachel. Her father, Laban, tricks him. That's just crazy. Can you imagine getting tricked on your wedding night? So that's a whole other story. So he ends up marrying Leah, but then he wakes up in the morning, he's like, you're not Rachel. And then Laban's like, okay, if you agree to work for me another 7 years. Man, this guy, he's clever. He's got Jacob trapped here. Work for me another 7 years. I'll let you marry her next week. Yeah, I mean, this is better than Korean drama. I mean, if you read the Old Testament story, it's just crazy. This is not the story of those who are so great in their faith. It's a mess. But at the end of each of their lives, it's very interesting. Isaac blesses Jacob and Esau. And he does that willingly now. Remember, Esau, he despised his birthright. He sold it for a pot of stew. Then Jacob steals the blessing by pretending to be Esau. It's just a mess. But what's interesting about all that is the blessing that Isaac gave to Jacob, he didn't rescind it. He didn't change it. He said it stands. Jacob receives the blessing of the firstborn, even though he stole it. And Esau wants to kill Jacob. And then Jacob goes away. And after all those years, he finally comes back. And both Jacob and Esau are there when Isaac dies. And before Isaac dies, he blesses them both. What do you think drove that blessing? I can't help but think this. Isaac, for all his weaknesses, Isaac is not very remarkable in his record here. But the one thing he knew was this. My father was going to offer me up as a burnt offering, and God provided a lamb. And he is keeping his promise. So he tells Jacob and Esau, remember the God who keeps his promises. And then when Jacob blesses the sons of Joseph, and that's really interesting because he bypasses the sons, his own sons, and he goes to the sons of Joseph, whom Joseph had in Egypt, Ephraim and Manasseh. And even then he switches them. He blesses the younger. He crosses his arms like this because Ephraim is the one who's going to be blessed. And what do you think drove that? Now, these three, what's being mentioned is when they die, what is it that they're passing down? They are passing down the blessing. And they want to remind them of the God who keeps his promises. Joseph, before he dies, he says, carry my bones back to the promised land. When you go back in 400 years, take my bones. What do you think his bones represented? Not just a skeleton. He was reminding them of the promise of a God who keeps his promises. God will take us back. They died well. Why? Because they died in faith. You know, the passage we looked at before, all these died in faith. They died believing. Even though they themselves had not seen the fulfillment of the promises, they believed God would keep his promises. I want to ask you this morning, do you believe in the God who keeps his promises? And if you do you prove it by trusting him, by obeying him? I don't think God's going to be asking any of us anytime soon, offer up your child as a burnt offering. I think what he does ask us is to offer up your lives as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable, for this is your acceptable worship to God. Romans 12:1. Do we? As parents, is that what we pass on to our children so that when they see our lives, that they would see, you know what, my mom and dad, what they showed me is this, despite all their imperfections. And parents, yes, we are not perfect. We fail. We mess up. But the one thing we can do is this. Children, trust in the God who keeps his promises. You know, I have no other desire for my children other than I want them to know Jesus. That's it. Everything else is gravy. But you can live without the gravy. I want them to know Christ. I want them to fear Christ. I want them to trust Christ. I want them to be with Christ for all eternity. I want them to believe in the God who could raise someone from the dead, because he did. He raised Christ from the dead. You know, as I get older, as my kids get older, things like this really strike me a bit more. We're all going to die one day. What blessing will you leave to your children and to your grandchildren? Will you tell them, trust in Yahweh? He is trustworthy. As we sang earlier, he is faithful. Great is thy faithfulness. There's nothing else more crucial in life than to know this. I'm going to ask you to bow your heads as we